April 14, 1945, Feldeshof, Germany. A frosty morning mist clung to the abandoned farmhouses as Frau Helga Müller hurriedly gathered her 3 children into the root cellar beneath their kitchen floor. She had heard the rumors about the approaching American forces, specifically about the fearsome Negro soldiers who would surely commit unspeakable atrocities against German civilians, especially children. Soon, she whispered to herself, we will be safe when our Führer's secret weapons drive these animals back across the Rhine. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a battalion of African-American soldiers from the segregated 761st Tank Battalion and 92nd Infantry Division would transform a community's deepest fears into something entirely unexpected, revealing how propaganda collapses when confronted with the simple reality of human decency. The American command vehicle lurched forward on the muddy road, leading into the small Bavarian village of Feldeshof. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams, commander of the 761st Black Panthers Tank Battalion, studied his map with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. His unit, along with elements of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had been pushing forward relentlessly through southern Germany for the past 17 days. "Sir, village up ahead. Appears abandoned," reported Sergeant James Cooper, peering through binoculars from the turret. Williams nodded. At 42, he was older than most battalion commanders. A graduate of Howard University, who'd spent 16 years in a segregated army, fighting not just America's enemies, but the constant skepticism of his own military leadership. The 761st had proven themselves in combat since landing in France, with 183 days of continuous fighting, longer than any other American tank battalion in the European theater. "Tell the men to proceed with caution," Williams ordered. "Intelligence reports indicate pockets of Wehrmacht soldiers in these villages, possibly Hitler Youth as well. They've been feeding these people all kinds of lies about what we'll do when we arrive." Sergeant Cooper relayed the orders through the radio. "First platoon taking point, second and third providing flank security, Buffalo Soldiers on foot support. The convoy of Sherman tanks, their olive drab paint chipped and splattered with mud, advanced cautiously into Feldeshof." The village consisted of approximately 60 buildings, mostly timber-framed Bavarian homes with steep roofs, a small church with a modest steeple and several barns and workshops. The streets were empty, though occasional movement behind curtains betrayed the presence of frightened residents. Inside the lead tank, battling bastards, Private First Class Demetrius Jackson guided the machine down the narrow main street. At 23, Jackson had been a machinist's apprentice in Detroit before the war. His hands, once used to craft precision parts, now controlled 35 tons of American steel. "Like a ghost town," he muttered to his gunner, Corporal Ray Williamson. "They're watching us," Williamson replied, scanning the buildings through his sight. "Probably think we have horns and tails." The American advance had been preceded by an organized propaganda campaign by retreating Nazi officials. For weeks, they had been distributing leaflets and hosting special meetings, warning German civilians about the approaching American forces, with particular emphasis on the savage black soldiers. The Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's newspaper, had published lurid stories claiming that African-American troops had been deliberately released from prisons and asylums in America and sent to Europe specifically to brutalize German civilians. In homes throughout Feldeshof, terrified families huddled in cellars and attics. Many had hidden their daughters in haylofts and their young sons in root cellars. The village's mayor, Heinrich Bauer, had fled 2 days earlier with the last Wehrmacht officers, leaving the village's elderly priest, Father Johannes Klinger, as the sole remaining authority figure. The 59-year-old priest watched the American tanks from his church window, fingering the wooden crucifix around his neck. Unlike many, Father Klinger harbored private doubts about the Nazi propaganda. Before the war, he had visited Rome and met Catholic priests from America, including a Negro priest from New Orleans. The experience had left him skeptical of the dehumanizing racial ideology that had dominated Germany for the past 12 years. As the last tank entered the village square, Lieutenant Colonel Williams ordered his men to establish a perimeter and begin house-to-house searches for German military personnel. "Captain Davis," Williams called to his executive officer, "get the Buffalo soldiers to secure the church and that large building that looks like a town hall. I want translators ready." Captain Robert Davis, a former high school history teacher from Philadelphia, acknowledged the order. He directed Company B of the 92nd Infantry Division to move toward the church. Staff Sergeant Elijah Franklin led his squad toward the stone building. Franklin, 31, had been a postal worker in Harlem before the draft. His squad consisted of 11 men, most of whom had faced discrimination and segregation their entire lives, only to be sent to Europe to fight for freedoms they themselves were denied back home. "Thompson, Jones, secure the rear entrance," Franklin ordered. "Martinez, you're our best German speaker. You're with me at the front door." Private First Class Diego Martinez nodded. Born to Mexican immigrants in San Antonio, he had learned German from neighbors in his predominantly German-American neighborhood. His language skills had made him invaluable, despite the military's initial reluctance to place him with the black unit. Martinez approached the heavy wooden doors of the church and knocked firmly. "U.S. Army. Anyone inside, please come to the door with your hands visible." After a tense moment, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the weathered face of Father Klinger. "Guten Tag," the priest said cautiously. "I am Father Johannes Klinger. I speak some English." Martinez translated for Sergeant Franklin, who stepped forward. "Sir, we need to know if there are any German soldiers in this building or anywhere in the village," Franklin said, his voice firm but not threatening. Father Klinger shook his head. "No soldiers. They left 2 days ago. Only civilians remain, mostly women, children, and old people. They are very afraid." "They don't need to be afraid of us," Franklin replied. "We're not here to hurt civilians." The priest's eyes studied Franklin's face. Many terrible stories were told about. He hesitated, searching for diplomatic words. "About Negro soldiers?" Franklin finished for him, his expression unchanged. "Yes, we know what they've been saying." Meanwhile, in another part of the village, Corporal Marcus Jenkins and PFC William Dubois of the 761st were conducting searches of residential buildings. Jenkins, who had been a medical student at Meharry Medical College before the war, carried extra rations in his pack, a habit he'd developed after seeing the malnourished condition of civilians in liberated territories. As they approached a small farmhouse, they noticed fresh footprints in the muddy yard. "Someone's home," Dubois whispered, readying his M1 Garand rifle. Jenkins nodded and approached the door. "U.S. Army? Anyone inside?" No response came. Jenkins tried the handle and found the door unlocked. Carefully, the two soldiers entered the dim interior of the home. The main room appeared recently abandoned, a pot of soup still warm on the stove, chairs pushed back hastily from the table. "Check upstairs," Jenkins instructed. "I'll look down here." As Dubois climbed the narrow staircase, Jenkins surveyed the kitchen. His attention was drawn to a slight unevenness in the floor, a trapdoor partially concealed by a rug that had been hastily replaced. Jenkins called out again, "We know you're here. We're not going to hurt you. Please come out." After a long silence, a woman's voice responded in German from beneath the floor. Though Jenkins couldn't understand the words, the fear in her voice was universal. "Dubois," he called. "Get Martinez over here. We need a translator." Within minutes, Martinez arrived and called down to the hidden family. "The American soldiers are here to liberate your village. They will not harm you. Please come out so we can speak." Slowly, the trapdoor lifted, and a pale, frightened face emerged. Helga Müller, 36 years old, a farmer's wife whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. Behind her were 3 children, Dieter, 11, Lisbeth, 8, and Kurt, just 5 years old. The children stared at the black soldiers with a mixture of terror and fascination. They had never seen anyone with dark skin before, and after years of propaganda depicting black people as subhuman monsters, the reality of the calm, disciplined soldiers before them caused considerable cognitive dissonance. Martinez spoke gently to the family, explaining that the American forces would be establishing a temporary headquarters in the village and that food aid would soon follow. Corporal Jenkins knelt to eye level with the youngest child, Kurt, who shrank back behind his mother's skirts. Jenkins slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a small, precious item, a Hershey's chocolate bar, part of his personal rations that he'd been saving. "It's okay," he said, smiling and unwrapping the chocolate. He broke off a small piece and ate it himself, then offered the bar to the child. Martinez translated, explaining that it was American chocolate, a treat for the children. Hesitantly, Kurt reached out and took the chocolate. His first taste of the sweet confection brought an involuntary smile to his face, the first his mother had seen in many months. This simple act, a black American soldier sharing chocolate with a German child, would become one of countless small interactions that day that began to dismantle years of racial propaganda in Feldeshof. By mid-afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Williams had established his command post in the village's former Nazi Party headquarters, a bitter irony not lost on the black officers. The building's walls were still adorned with maps showing the inevitable victory of the Third Reich and posters depicting racist caricatures of Germany's enemies. "Sir," reported Captain Davis, "we've completed our sweep of the village. No military personnel found. Approximately 178 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly. They're scared but cooperating." Williams nodded, studying a situation map. "And our supplies? 3 days of combat rations for our men, limited medical supplies. We're expecting a supply convoy tomorrow if the roads hold." Williams made a decision. "Contact Division. Tell them we need additional food supplies for civilian relief, and get Sergeant Washington's medical team to set up a clinic in that school building. I want every child in this village examined for malnutrition." "Yes, sir," Davis replied, then hesitated. "Sir, about the civilians. Many of them are starting to come out now, but they're still terrified of our men." Williams removed his helmet and ran a hand over his close-cropped gray hair. "Time will solve that problem, Captain. Actions speak louder than propaganda. Have our men continue to behave with the utmost professionalism." He paused, "and distribute 1K ration per household as a goodwill gesture." By evening, word had spread throughout Feldeshof that the American soldiers were sharing their food. The calculated kindness of Lieutenant Colonel Williams was having its intended effect, creating an environment where the civilians could begin to question the propaganda they had been fed about these men. In the church, which had been converted to an aid station and community gathering point, Father Klinger observed the interaction between the villagers and the American soldiers with growing fascination. He had expected many things from this occupation, perhaps harsh treatment, retribution for Nazi crimes, or at minimum cold military efficiency. What he had not expected was the peculiar gentleness he observed, particularly from men who, according to everything he had been told, should have been filled with hatred. Technical Sergeant Walter Freeman, a former church deacon from Georgia, had set up a field kitchen in the church courtyard. As he stirred a large pot of soup made from army rations supplemented with local vegetables, he conversed with Father Klinger. "You seem surprised by us," Freeman remarked, noticing the priest's thoughtful observation. "I am," Father Klinger admitted. "We were told many things about Negro soldiers, terrible things." Freeman nodded, continuing to stir. "I imagine you were. Same kind of lies they tell about us back home in parts of America." The priest's eyebrows rose. "Even in America? But you are Americans." "Yes, we are," Freeman replied simply. "Americans who weren't allowed to eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers during training. Americans who were told we weren't smart enough to fight in tanks or operate complex equipment. Americans who are good enough to die for our country, but not good enough to be treated as equals." Father Klinger was silent, absorbing this information that contradicted everything the Nazi regime had claimed about America's racial hierarchies, aligning with their own beliefs. "Yet you still fight for America," he observed finally. Freeman paused his stirring and looked directly at the priest. "We fight for what America should be, not always what it is. And we fight because defeating Hitler's ideas is important for all people, including black folks." As darkness fell over Feldeshof, the American soldiers established guard positions around the village perimeter. Intelligence reports indicated scattered groups of SS diehards in the region, fanatically loyal and potentially dangerous. In the Müller household, Helga was putting her children to bed when 8-year-old Lisbeth asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mutti, Why aren't the Americans mean like the Burgermeister said they would be, especially the black ones? He said they would hurt us. Helga hesitated, struggling to reconcile her own fading fears with her daughter's innocent question. Sometimes, Lisbeth, people tell lies about others because they are afraid, or because they want others to be afraid. I think perhaps the Burgermeister was wrong. I like the chocolate man, 5-year-old Kurt interjected sleepily, referring to Corporal Jenkins. Before Helga could respond, a commotion outside drew her attention. Shouts and the sound of vehicles moving quickly through the village broke the evening quiet. She rushed to the window to see American soldiers running to defensive positions as a truck sped into the village square. It was an American medical truck from the 25th Field Hospital. Inside was a critically wounded German soldier who had been found by an American patrol. Despite being the enemy, the Americans had stabilized him and brought him to the nearest medical facility, which happened to be the makeshift clinic established by the 761st's medical team. Word spread quickly through the village as the German soldier, barely 18, a Hitler Youth member pressed into Volkssturm service, was carried into the school building. Many residents watched from windows and doorways as black American medics rushed to save the life of a young man who, just days earlier, would have been trying to kill them. Inside the makeshift hospital, Sergeant Leonard Washington, who had completed 2 years of medical school at Howard University before the war, worked feverishly alongside his team. The young German soldier had suffered a severe abdominal wound and significant blood loss. "He needs plasma," Washington announced. "Jenkins, get the supply from the truck. Martinez, tell any villagers outside that we need anyone with medical training to assist." As the medical team worked to save the German soldier, Father Klinger arrived with Frau Gerda Weiss, who had been the village midwife and informal nurse for 20 years. Initially hesitant, she quickly integrated into the medical effort, following Washington's instructions and translating for the semi-conscious patient. The surgery lasted 3 hours. By the time they finished, Sergeant Washington and his team had removed shrapnel, repaired damaged tissue, and transfused precious blood plasma, supplies intended for American soldiers, into the young German. "Will he live?" Father Klinger asked, as Washington finally stepped away from the operating table, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood. "If infection doesn't set in, yes," Washington replied, washing his hands in a basin. "He's young and strong." Frau Weiss looked at Washington with unconcealed amazement. "You saved his life. Why?" "He is German, your enemy." Washington dried his hands carefully before answering. "Because I'm a medic first, soldier second, and because that boy was lied to his whole life, just like you were lied to about us." The news of the German soldier's treatment spread through Feldeshof overnight, becoming a powerful counterpoint to years of propaganda. By morning, the atmosphere in the village had subtly shifted. Doors that had been firmly shut now stood ajar. Faces appeared more freely in windows. Children, with their natural resilience and curiosity, were the first to openly approach the American soldiers. The second day of occupation began with Lieutenant Colonel Williams addressing his officers. "Gentlemen, Division has radioed that we'll be holding this position for at least 4 more days while they consolidate forces for the push south. That gives us time to establish proper civil-military operations here." Captain Davis reported, "The supply convoy is expected by noon. They're bringing additional rations, medical supplies, and mail for the men." Williams nodded. "Good. Once those supplies arrive, I want to implement a formal civilian aid program, not just food distribution, but getting essential services running again. Their water system is intact, but the power station needs repair. Let's get our engineers on that." The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Father Klinger, who requested permission to speak with the commander. "Colonel," the priest began, "I come as a representative of the village. We wish to, that is..." He struggled to find the right words. "Take your time, Father," Williams encouraged. "The people are ashamed," Klinger finally said. "They believed terrible things about your men, especially the Negro soldiers. Now they see how these men share food with our children, treat our wounded, even a German soldier, with dignity. They do not know how to reconcile what they were told with what they see." Williams considered his response carefully. "Father, propaganda is a powerful weapon. Your people have been subjected to it for years. We don't blame them for believing what they were forced to hear every day. Klinger nodded gratefully. There is something else. 3 families in our village are hiding Jewish spouses or children. They have been hidden for 2 years since the deportations began. They are afraid to come out, even now. This information electrified Williams. The discovery and protection of Holocaust victims had become a priority for Allied forces as they advanced into Germany. Captain Davis, arrange for a private meeting with these families, Williams ordered. Assure them of our protection and contact division immediately. We need to get proper documentation for these people as soon as possible. As promised, the supply convoy arrived at noon. Along with military supplies came significant humanitarian aid, powdered milk, flour, medical supplies, and most excitingly for the children, crates of Hershey's chocolate bars, specifically included for civilian distribution. Corporal Jenkins, now recognized throughout the village as the Chocolate Man, was placed in charge of distributing these treats. He set up a table in the village square, and soon a line of children formed, each receiving a chocolate bar and a friendly word from the tall, gentle soldier who had become an unlikely celebrity in Feldeshof. Among them was Kurt Müller, no longer hiding behind his mother, but eagerly greeting Jenkins with a shy smile. "Schokolade bitte," the boy managed in German, then proudly added, "Please, chocolate," in carefully practiced English. Jenkins laughed and handed the boy 2 chocolate bars. "One for you and one for your sister," he explained through Martinez's translation. Kurt beamed with pride at his special treatment. Observing this interaction was Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who had slipped back into the village disguised as a farmer. He had been sent by his retreating unit to assess American forces and possibly organize resistance among the villagers. What he witnessed, however, was dismantling any hope of turning the population against the occupiers. Hoffmann watched from the shadow of a building as Black American soldiers, the same savages he had helped depict in propaganda materials, calmly distributed food and medical aid, repaired the village's water pump, and treated the residents with unexpected dignity. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful for him. Later that afternoon, Hoffmann approached Helga Müller, whom he knew to be a formerly dedicated Nazi Party member through her late husband's position. "Frau Müller," he said quietly, finding her alone in her garden. "You recognize me?" She started, then lowered her voice. "Major Hoffmann, you shouldn't be here. The Americans will arrest you." "I'm here to organize resistance," he replied. "Loyal Germans must make the occupation difficult until our forces can regroup. The Führer has new weapons coming that will turn the tide." Helga looked at him skeptically. "Major, with respect, we have heard about these wonder weapons for 2 years while our men die on all fronts." She gestured toward the village square. "Look there. My Kurt takes chocolate from a Negro soldier, the same kind of men you told us would murder our children. Instead, they give medicine to old Frau Schmidt and repaired her roof." "It's a trick," Hoffmann insisted, his voice strained. "A way to lower our guard before—" "Before what?" Helga interrupted. "Before they save another German boy like they did last night? My husband died for these lies, Major. I will not risk my children for more of them." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Hoffmann alone with the uncomfortable realization that his propaganda was collapsing under the weight of observed reality. As the afternoon progressed, the most extraordinary development occurred when the 3 families hiding Jewish relatives finally emerged. With great trepidation, they came to the American headquarters, accompanied by Father Klinger. Among them was David Rosen, a 60-year-old former mathematics professor who had been hidden in an attic by his non-Jewish wife for over 2 years. With him was their daughter, Hannah, now 17, who had missed her entire adolescence in hiding. Lieutenant Colonel Williams met them personally, arranging for special rations and medical examinations. He assigned Staff Sergeant Franklin and his squad as their personal protection detail until proper arrangements could be made. Hannah Rosen, pale from years without sunlight, stared in wonder at Sergeant Franklin and his men. "You are Americans," she said in halting English. "Black Americans." The Nazis said Americans segregated their Negroes, that you were treated as we Jews were. Franklin exchanged glances with his men before responding carefully. America isn't perfect, miss. We do face discrimination. But what happened to your people here? That's something different altogether. David Rosen spoke up. Yet you fight for America despite this treatment? Franklin nodded. We fight for what America claims to stand for, even when it fails to live up to those ideals. And we fight against ideas like the ones that put you in that attic. As evening approached on the second day of occupation, a remarkable scene unfolded in the village square. The residents of Feldeshof, overcoming their initial terror, had organized a small gesture of gratitude, a community meal combining American rations with local provisions. Tables were arranged in the square, and German families sat alongside American soldiers in a tableau that would have been unthinkable just days before. Black soldiers who had been portrayed as beasts in Nazi propaganda broke bread with German civilians, who now saw them as liberators and protectors. Major Hoffman watched this scene from a distance, his worldview crumbling. The racial hierarchy that had been a cornerstone of Nazi ideology was being demolished, not by force or argument, but by the simple reality of human decency, transcending artificial divisions. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit in the square, 11-year-old Dieter Müller approached Staff Sergeant Franklin with a homemade gift, a crude but heartfelt drawing showing black American soldiers giving chocolate to German children. Danke, the boy said simply, pressing the drawing into Franklin's hands before running back to his mother. Franklin studied the childish artwork with its stark representations, the German children drawn with yellow hair, the American soldiers colored with dark brown crayon. In its innocent simplicity, the drawing captured a profound truth that sophisticated propaganda had tried to obscure: their shared humanity. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, observing from nearby, stepped closer to Franklin. "Quite an artist," he remarked. "Yes, sir," Franklin replied, carefully folding the drawing to keep in his pocket. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If things could be this simple back home," Williams sighed. "That's why what we're doing here matters, Sergeant. Not just winning the war, but how we win it. These children will remember this. Maybe they'll build something better than what came before." As the impromptu celebration continued, Father Klinger offered a prayer in both German and English, thanking God for deliverance and asking for healing between former enemies. The prayer was followed by an unexpected moment. Technical Sergeant Freeman, the former deacon, began to sing in a rich baritone, the spiritual Swing Low Sweet Chariot, rising into the night air above Feldeshof. One by one, other soldiers joined in, the haunting melody of hope and deliverance filling the square. Though the Germans couldn't understand the words, the music transcended language, speaking directly to their shared experience of suffering and hope for redemption. In the shadows beyond the celebration, Major Hoffman made his decision. The resistance he had been sent to organize was pointless, not because it was militarily impossible, but because it was morally bankrupt. The ideology he had served was built on lies that were now exposed beyond repair. Removing his concealed Walther pistol, he placed it on the ground. Then, straightening his civilian jacket, he walked slowly toward Lieutenant Colonel Williams and surrendered himself. The third day dawned with news spreading through the village. The hidden Wehrmacht officer had given himself up. More surprisingly, he had provided valuable intelligence about German troop movements and defensive positions further south. For the residents of Feldeshof, this surrender represented another crack in the foundation of their former beliefs. If even Major Hoffman, known for his dedication to the Nazi cause, had laid down his arms, perhaps everything they had been told was suspect. The third day of occupation brought an unexpected development to Feldeshof. A convoy of American journalists arrived, accompanied by a film crew from the Army Signal Corps. The war was nearing its end, and the Allied command was documenting both the liberation and the conditions of German civilians under Nazi rule. Among the journalists was Catherine Morrison of the Associated Press, one of the few female war correspondents operating in the European theatre. At 34, Morrison had covered everything from the Normandy landings to the liberation of Paris. Her editor had specifically assigned her to document the experiences of the all-black units that had been largely overlooked in mainstream war coverage. Lieutenant Colonel Williams received the journalists at his headquarters, where he provided a briefing on the situation in Feldeshof and the operations of the 761st and elements of the 92nd Division. "Colonel," Morrison asked, notebook in hand, "your men have been fighting continuously for over 183 days. That's longer than any other American tank battalion. Yet back home, many newspapers barely mention the contributions of Negro troops. How does that affect morale?" Williams considered his response carefully. "Ms. Morrison, my men didn't come to Europe expecting headlines. They came to prove something. To themselves, to the army, and to the country back home. Every tank they knock out, every town they liberate speaks louder than any newspaper article." Morrison nodded, making notes. "And what about your reception by German civilians? Given Nazi racial ideology, that must create unique challenges." "Initially, yes," Williams acknowledged. "The Germans were fed a steady diet of propaganda about black soldiers. They were told to hide their women and children from us, but actions speak louder than words. My men have conducted themselves with discipline and humanity. The results speak for themselves." After the interview, Morrison requested permission to speak with some of the villagers directly. Williams assigned PFC Martinez to accompany her as a translator. Their first stop was the makeshift medical clinic where Sergeant Washington was checking on the wounded German soldier they had saved. The young man, identified as Heinrich Müller, no relation to Helga's family, was conscious now, but weak. When Morrison entered with her camera, his eyes widened in surprise. "Ask him if I may take his photograph and interview him," Morrison requested through Martinez. The young German nodded weakly after the translation. Morrison's photographer captured the image of the pale German youth being tended to by Sergeant Washington, a powerful visual contradiction to Nazi propaganda. "Ask him what he was told about American Negro soldiers," Morrison prompted. Martinez translated the question, and the young German's response was revealing. "He says they were told black American troops were criminals released from prisons specifically to brutalize German civilians," Martinez translated. "His Hitler Youth leader showed them pictures from American lynchings and told them this is how black Americans treat those they consider inferior." Morrison's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. "And now, how does he feel being treated by black American medics?" The question was translated, and Heinrich responded with visible emotion. "He says he doesn't understand why they saved him," Martinez relayed. "He says, according to everything he was taught, they should have let him die or worse. He says it makes him question everything." Throughout that day, Morrison interviewed numerous villagers and soldiers, documenting the rapidly evolving relationship between the occupied and their occupiers. Her most poignant interview came when she spoke with Helga Müller and her children, particularly 8-year-old Lisbeth and 5-year-old Kurt. "The little boy calls Corporal Jenkins the chocolate man," Martinez translated as Helga explained Kurt's new friendship with the American soldier. "He waits by the window each morning to see him on patrol." Morrison smiled at the child. "And what do you think of the American soldiers now?" she asked, with Martinez translating. Kurt's response was direct and childlike. "They are nice. They have chocolate. They fixed our water pump. They are not monsters, like the mayor said." Morrison's story, which would eventually be published in newspapers across America under the headline "Black Liberators: How Chocolate and Compassion Conquered Nazi Propaganda," included a photograph of Kurt Müller accepting a chocolate bar from Corporal Jenkins. The image would become one of the iconic photographs of the final days of the European conflict, a simple moment capturing the collapse of an ideology. The Army Signal Corps film crew, meanwhile, captured footage of the 761st tanks in the village and interviews with several soldiers about their experiences. This footage, much of which wouldn't be widely seen until decades later in historical documentaries, provided rare visual documentation of African-American combat units in the European theater. Staff Sergeant Franklin, selected to speak on camera because of his articulate manner, offered a perspective that resonated beyond the immediate circumstances. "The Germans had a theory about people like me," he told the interviewer standing beside his tank. "That theory said I was something less than human because of the color of my skin. Back home in America, there are people with theories that don't look so different." What we've learned here is that when you put those theories up against reality, against flesh and blood human beings breaking bread together, those theories don't hold up very well. By the fourth day, significant changes were evident throughout Feldeshof. American engineers had restored electrical power to most of the village. The water system was fully operational. A regular distribution system for food aid had been established, with German civilians themselves helping to organize the fair allocation of supplies. More remarkably, the social barriers had begun to dissolve. German children now approached black soldiers without hesitation. Elderly villagers offered what little they could, a cup of ersatz coffee, homemade bread, or simply conversation, to the men they had feared just days before. In the town square, Technical Sergeant Freeman had organized an impromptu baseball game, teaching German children the basics of America's pastime using a makeshift ball created from wound string and a bat carved from a broken doorpost. The sounds of children's laughter filled the air as they attempted to grasp the unfamiliar rules. 9-9, Freeman called out good-naturedly to 11-year-old Dieter Müller, who had run to third base instead of first after hitting the ball. First base, Erster! He pointed, and the children erupted in laughter as Dieter changed direction, sprinting toward the correct base, while the American soldiers cheered him on. Watching this scene from her garden was Frau Adelheid Fischer, at 72, one of the village's oldest residents. She had lived through the First World War, the Weimar Republic, and the entire Nazi era. Her son had died fighting in Russia, and her husband had passed away just before the war. She had initially been among the most terrified of the American occupation, barricading her door and refusing to emerge for the first 2 days. Now she sat on her small bench, knitting needles moving steadily as she observed the baseball game. When Private William Dubois noticed her watching, he approached with a canteen cup of water. "Wasser, Frau?" he offered with a smile. The elderly woman accepted the cup with slightly trembling hands. "Danke," she replied, then added in heavily accented English, "You are kind, not what they said." Dubois, understanding the meaning if not all the words, simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am, not what they said." This interaction was observed by David Rosen, the Jewish mathematician who had spent 2 years hiding in an attic with his daughter. Now able to walk freely for the first time, Rosen approached Dubois after the older woman had returned to her knitting. "It is remarkable," Rosen commented. 3 days ago she would have believed you would murder her. Now she accepts water from your hands." Dubois shrugged. "People can change when they see the truth with their own eyes." "Not all people," Rosen replied sadly. "Some of our neighbors knew us for decades, yet still they would have turned us in to the Gestapo." Dubois nodded soberly. "We've got those kinds back home too, the kind that would rather believe a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth." This conversation touched on a question that was increasingly occupying Lieutenant Colonel Williams as the occupation continued. What would happen to Feldeshof after his unit moved on? How permanent would the changes be that were occurring in this village? That afternoon, Williams called a meeting with Father Klinger and several of the village elders who had emerged as informal leaders in the absence of Nazi officials. "In 2 days, my battalion will be moving south to continue operations," Williams informed them. "We'll be replaced by a regular military government detachment who will oversee this area until civil authority can be properly restored." Father Klinger nodded solemnly. "We understand, Colonel, but many are afraid of what will happen when your men leave. Specifically, your Negro soldiers have earned the trust of our people." Williams had anticipated this concern. "The military government personnel will continue the aid programs we've established, and they will enforce strict non-fraternization rules to protect your civilians. It is not protection from the Americans we worry about," explained Otto Schmidt, a 64-year-old former schoolteacher who had never joined the Nazi Party. "It is protection from ourselves, from those who may wish to punish people for being too friendly with your men, especially the black soldiers." Williams understood immediately. Even as Nazi power collapsed, the threat of reprisals against perceived collaborators remained very real. "I'll speak with Division about this specific concern," Williams promised. "In the meantime, I recommend documenting everything: the medical aid, food distribution, and repairs to the village infrastructure. Facts will be your best defense against any accusations." After the meeting, Williams radioed division headquarters with his concerns, stressing the unique situation that had developed in Feldeshof and the potential dangers to civilians who had cooperated with his men. The response came that evening. The 761st and attached units would remain in Feldeshof for 3 additional days, and the military government detachment would include personnel specifically briefed on the situation. Additionally, Catherine Morrison's pending news article was being expedited through Army censors, as positive coverage of the situation could help protect the villagers by making their case more widely known. On the 5th day, an unexpected visitor arrived in a jeep escorted by military police, Major General John B. Brooks, the divisional commander. His presence in a small village like Feldeshof was unprecedented and immediately created a stir among both soldiers and civilians. Lieutenant Colonel Williams met the general at the village entrance and provided a brief walking tour, during which they observed the ongoing humanitarian operations, the restored services, and most notably the comfortable interaction between the Black American soldiers and German civilians. "Remarkable work, Williams," General Brooks commented as they watched Corporal Jenkins instructing a group of German children on the proper technique for brushing teeth, using supplies from American aid packages. "Frankly, I wasn't sure what to expect when I sent the 761st in here. Intelligence indicated this was a heavily Nazified village." "It was, sir," Williams confirmed, "but most of these people were victims of propaganda, not true believers. Once they saw reality didn't match what they'd been told about us, particularly about Negro soldiers, the propaganda collapsed quickly." The general nodded thoughtfully. "Morrison's article has already been wired back to the States. Stars and Stripes will run it tomorrow. It's exactly the kind of story the Army needs right now, both for the folks back home and for our occupation policy moving forward." Later, General Brooks addressed the assembled men of the 761st and attached units, commending them for their conduct and informing them that their actions in Feldeshof would be included in the official military government handbook as a case study in effective civil-military operations. "What you've accomplished here goes beyond military objectives," Brooks told them. "You've demonstrated the best of American values in a place where America was systematically demonized. Each of you, through your personal conduct, has been an ambassador for our country and for the truth about our people. All our people." For the black soldiers listening to these words, the general's recognition represented something they had rarely experienced: acknowledgement of their full humanity and contribution, not as Negro soldiers, but simply as Americans serving their country with distinction. That evening, the village organized a more formal thank you for the American troops. The town square was decorated with handmade signs reading "Danke" and "Thank you." Tables were arranged with white cloths, and what little food could be spared was prepared to supplement the American rations. Father Klinger offered a blessing in both German and English, thanking God for bringing unexpected friends in a time of greatest need. The elderly priest, who had once accepted much of the Nazi racial ideology without question, now stood as a symbol of how quickly such artificial divisions could dissolve when confronted with human reality. During the meal, Hannah Rosen, the 17-year-old Jewish girl who had spent 2 years in hiding, approached Staff Sergeant Franklin with a request that surprised him. "I want to learn English," she explained through Martinez's translation. "Real English, American English. When the war is over, I want to go to America. Will you teach me some words?" Franklin, touched by her request, spent the next hour giving an impromptu English lesson to Hannah and several other village teenagers who joined out of curiosity. The scene, a Black American sergeant teaching English to German teenagers, including a Jewish girl who days earlier had been hiding for her life, captured the remarkable transformation occurring in Feldeshof. Not everyone in the village had embraced this transformation, however. A small group of dedicated Nazi Party members, including the former deputy mayor Friedrich Weber, had been watching these developments with mounting anger. To them, the friendly relations between racial inferiors and German civilians represented the ultimate betrayal of Nazi ideology. On the morning of the 6th day, their resentment took a dangerous form. As Corporal Jenkins was inspecting the village's water pump on the outskirts of town, he was ambushed by Weber and 2 other men. Armed with hunting rifles, they attacked the isolated soldier, severely wounding him before fleeing into the surrounding forest. The shot alerted nearby sentries, who quickly found Jenkins bleeding from a shoulder wound. Within minutes, the battalion's medical team was treating him while other soldiers secured the area. Lieutenant Colonel Williams immediately ordered a full lockdown of the village, with all civilians confined to their homes while a house-by-house search was conducted. The atmosphere of trust that had been carefully built over the previous days was suddenly in jeopardy. As Sergeant Washington worked to stabilize Jenkins in the medical station, a crowd of concerned villagers gathered outside, despite orders to remain indoors. Among them were Helga Müller and her children, with young Kurt crying inconsolably upon learning that the chocolate man had been hurt. Father Klinger approached the American guards, requesting to speak with Colonel Williams. After being thoroughly searched, he was allowed through. "Colonel," the priest began urgently, "I know who did this. It was Weber and his friends. They have been angry about the friendship between your men and our people. Many in the village suspected they were planning something." "Why didn't anyone report these suspicions?" Williams demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. Father Klinger looked down in shame. "Fear, Colonel. Even now, with the Reich collapsing, people fear retribution. Weber threatened that anyone who became too friendly with the Americans would be punished when true Germans returned to power." Williams processed this information quickly. "Do you know where they might have gone?" "Yes," the priest replied. "Weber has a hunting cabin in the forest, 3 kilometers east. He has boasted that he stored weapons and supplies there in preparation for continuing the fight." Williams immediately organized a search party, led by Staff Sergeant Franklin, who had volunteered despite the obvious danger. "Jenkins is my friend, sir," Franklin stated simply when Williams questioned his eagerness for the mission. As the search party prepared to depart, something unexpected occurred. Several German villagers, including Otto Schmidt and Dieter Müller's teenage cousin Karl, approached and offered to guide the Americans to Weber's cabin. Their assistance, coming voluntarily after one of the black soldiers had been attacked, marked a profound shift in allegiance. "Why would you help us find him?" Franklin asked Karl through Martinez's translation. "He's your countryman." Karl's response was translated, "Not anymore. My countrymen wouldn't shoot a man who gives chocolate to children and medicine to the sick. Weber is not Germany's future. He is its shameful past." With the German volunteers leading, the search party moved through the forest with greater speed and certainty than would otherwise have been possible. They approached the cabin carefully, establishing a perimeter before calling for those inside to surrender. Instead of surrendering, Weber and his companions opened fire. A brief but intense firefight ensued, ending when one of Weber's men was wounded, and Weber himself ran out of ammunition. The third man surrendered immediately after that. Weber, captured and disarmed, maintained his defiant stance, even as he was marched back to the village. "You are race traitors," he shouted at the German volunteers who had helped capture him, "consorting with Untermenschen. The Führer will punish all of you when the final victory comes." Karl, walking alongside Staff Sergeant Franklin, didn't bother responding to Weber's tirade. Instead, he asked Franklin through Martinez, "What will happen to him?" "He'll be handed over to the military government," Franklin replied. "They'll determine if he's to be tried as a war criminal or just as a common murderer if Corporal Jenkins doesn't make it." News that Weber and his accomplices had been captured spread quickly through Feldeshof. For many villagers, seeing the former deputy mayor, once a feared local Nazi official, reduced to a prisoner under black American guards was the final blow to whatever remained of Nazi authority in their minds. More significantly, the fact that fellow Germans had helped capture Weber represented a clear choice by the villagers about which version of Germany they wished to align themselves with moving forward. At the medical station, Sergeant Washington had successfully removed the bullet from Jenkins's shoulder. "He'll recover," Washington informed Williams. "The bullet missed any vital areas. With proper care, he should regain full use of his arm." The news was greeted with relief by the soldiers, and somewhat surprisingly by many of the villagers who had come to know Jenkins during the occupation. For 5-year-old Kurt Müller, the news that the chocolate man would recover prompted him to draw another picture. This one showing Jenkins with his arm in a sling, surrounded by German children offering him gifts. On the morning of the 7th day, with Jenkins stable and recovering, Preparations began for the 761st's departure the following day. The military government detachment was scheduled to arrive, bringing with them more substantial civilian aid supplies and administrative personnel to begin the formal occupation and denazification process. Lieutenant Colonel Williams used this final full day to ensure a smooth transition. He met with Father Klinger and other community leaders to establish a civilian committee that would work with the incoming military government officials. He made sure that the Jewish families who had been in hiding were properly documented and would receive special protection. Most importantly, he gathered statements from numerous villagers about their experiences with his men, creating an official record that could protect those who had cooperated from any future accusations of improper collaboration. Throughout the day, small gestures of gratitude continued to manifest from the villagers. Women brought small handicrafts as parting gifts for soldiers who had helped them. Children delivered handmade cards. Elderly residents shared stories and photographs of Feldeshof before the war, creating connections that transcended the brief occupation. Technical Sergeant Freeman, continuing his impromptu baseball lessons, was presented with a properly stitched baseball that the village cobbler had worked through the night to create. "For American game," the old man explained simply, pressing the ball into Freeman's hands. That evening, a more formal ceremony took place in the village square. Father Klinger, speaking for the community, expressed gratitude to the American soldiers who had not only liberated them from Nazi rule, but had also liberated many of them from the burden of racial hatred they had been taught. "You came as occupiers," the priest said, "but you leave as friends. You have shown us that humanity transcends the artificial divisions that men create to separate themselves from one another. This lesson is perhaps more valuable than the food or medicine you have provided." Lieutenant Colonel Williams responded with equal gravity. What has happened here in Feldeshof is what we hope will happen throughout Germany. Not just military victory, but victory over the ideas that made this war necessary. When we return to America, many of us will continue to face discrimination and prejudice. But what you have shown us is that change is possible, that people can learn to see beyond color when given the chance to know one another as human beings. Following the speeches, the villagers had prepared a surprise. A choir of children, hastily assembled and trained by the former music teacher, sang "America the Beautiful" in heavily accented but recognizable English. The simple gesture brought tears to the eyes of many of the hardened combat veterans who had fought their way across Europe. After the ceremony, as the soldiers returned to their bivouac areas to prepare for the next day's departure, Staff Sergeant Franklin found Hannah Rosen waiting to speak with him. "I have been practicing my English," she said carefully, each word deliberate. "I want to thank you for saving us, not just from hiding, but from hate." Franklin, touched by her effort, replied, "Your English is getting very good, Miss Rosen, and you're welcome. But remember, in many ways, you saved us too." Hannah looked confused. "How did we save you?" "By seeing us," Franklin explained. "Really seeing us, as men, as human beings. Not as whatever the propaganda said we were. That matters more than you know." On the final morning, the 761st Tank Battalion and their attached infantry prepared to move out. Their Sherman tanks, which had entered Feldeshof as intimidating weapons of war, were now decorated with small tokens from villagers. A child's drawing taped to a turret, wildflowers tucked into antenna mounts, a hand-knitted scarf tied to a machine gun barrel. As the soldiers made their final preparations, the villagers gathered along the main street, many holding small American flags that had been distributed from the battalion's limited supply. Children sat on their parents' shoulders for a better view. Even Frau Fischer, the elderly woman who had initially barricaded her door, stood waiting to bid farewell to the soldiers she had come to see as protectors rather than occupiers. In the medical station, a special arrangement had been made. Corporal Jenkins, though still recovering from his wound, would ride in the lead medical truck, allowing him to see the village one last time and, more importantly, allowing the villagers to see that he was recovering. As the convoy prepared to depart, 5-year-old Kurt Müller broke away from his mother and ran to the medical truck where Jenkins sat. "Chocolate man," he called out, holding up a small package wrapped in paper. "For you." A medic helped the boy hand his gift to Jenkins, who unwrapped it to find a small wooden carving, a crude but recognizable tank that Dieter had helped his younger brother create. "Danke, Kurt," Jenkins said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The boy beamed. "Auf Wiedersehen. Goodbye," he called, proudly using one of the English phrases he had learned. As the convoy slowly rolled out of Feldeshof, the villagers waved and called out their farewells. Many held up chocolate bar wrappers, a simple symbol that had come to represent the unexpected friendship that had developed in just 7 days. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, riding in the command vehicle at the head of the column, reflected on what had been accomplished in this small German village. The military objectives had been met, a strategic location secured, enemy combatants captured or neutralized, and civil authority re-established. But something more profound had occurred as well. In this tiny corner of a devastated Europe, people on both sides had glimpsed a possibility that the artificial barriers of race that had been central to Nazi ideology and remained entrenched in American society could dissolve when human beings were allowed to know each other directly, not through the distorting lens of propaganda. As the village disappeared from view around a bend in the road, Williams allowed himself a rare moment of hope. Perhaps what had happened in Feldeshof could happen elsewhere, not just in occupied Germany, but eventually in America itself. Perhaps the war, for all its horrors, could accelerate the breaking down of barriers that should never have existed. The 761st Black Panthers Tank Battalion would continue fighting until the German surrender on May 8, 1945, just weeks later. They would complete their combat tour, having spent 183 consecutive days in combat, more than any other American tank unit. They would suffer 156 casualties, including 24 killed in action, and be credited with capturing or liberating more than 30 towns. For their service, the men of the 761st received 391 decorations, including 11 Silver Stars and 69 Bronze Stars. Yet upon returning home, most would face the same discrimination they had experienced before the war. Many would be denied service at restaurants in the same uniforms they had worn while liberating Europe. Staff Sergeant Elijah Franklin would return to New York and use the GI Bill to complete a degree in education, eventually becoming a high school principal. He would remain in contact with Hannah Rosen, who did indeed emigrate to America in 1947, settling in Brooklyn and becoming a mathematics teacher. Corporal Marcus Jenkins recovered from his wound and returned to medical school, becoming one of the first black surgeons at a major hospital in Detroit. For years afterward, he would receive Christmas cards from the Muller family, often including drawings from Kurt and Lisbeth. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams retired from the Army in 1948 after President Truman's executive order desegregating the armed forces. He would later serve as a consultant when the story of the 761st was finally documented in historical texts decades after the war. As for Feldeshof, the village would be administered by American occupation forces until 1949, when it became part of West Germany. Father Klinger would continue as parish priest until his death in 1963, known for his passionate sermons against racial prejudice and his annual memorial service honoring the 761st. Helga Müller would eventually remarry, her second husband being a returning German POW who had been held in America and had similarly had his racial views transformed by direct experience. Kurt Müller, the chocolate boy, would grow up to become a teacher, often telling his students the story of how his first taste of chocolate came from the hands of an American soldier who had been portrayed as a monster but had proven to be a man of compassion. David and Hannah Rosen, after emigrating to America, would occasionally speak at events about their experiences during and after the Holocaust, always including the story of how black American soldiers had been among their liberators, despite facing discrimination in their own country. In 1978, a small museum display in the Feldeshof Town Hall was dedicated to the 761st's brief but transformative occupation. Among the artifacts preserved was a tattered Hershey's chocolate wrapper, a child's drawing of soldiers and children, and a photograph of Corporal Jenkins giving chocolate to a small German boy, simple objects that represented the power of human connection to overcome even the most deeply entrenched hatred. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.